Mr. President, 6 years ago, Tony Blair, who was at that moment President of the Council, when presenting the Multiannual Financial Framework for 2006-2012, said in this House, "Never again," he said at that moment. Never again must we repeat the negotiations on this framework in the same way. But we have to recognize, here we are again. And we are still talking about the same budget, a budget of more or less 1% of the GDP, and we are still dealing with a reluctant Britain. The only difference now is that Mr. Blair has been replaced by Mr. Cameron, and that the Labour Party is led now by Mr. Edward Miliband, who a few weeks ago, for, in my opinion, pure populistic reasons, has made a coalition with the Europhobes of the Conservative Party to make a deal on the EU budget even more difficult, if not impossible. So there we are for the moment. And I will not talk, Mr. President, about the details of this budget, but let me be very blunt. The whole debate on a little bit more, on a little bit less than 1% of the European GDP is, in my opinion, completely ridiculous. First of all, the budget of member states like Germany and France are 8 to 10 times bigger than the European budget. They have increased the last years faster than the European budget. European budget, colleagues, that's 140 billion. You know what the budgets are of all the member states of the European Union? 6,300 billion. 6.3 trillion euro are the budget of the member states, compared to the 140. That means 50 times bigger than the European budget. The daily contribution of citizens to the European budget is 67 cents a day. That's less than a cup of coffee, or for Mr. Callanan, less than a cup of tea. And then secondly, in the United States, the federal budget is 24% of GDP. Switzerland is a confederation and has even a budget of 12% of GDP. And we cannot agree on 1%. European budget is smaller than the budget of smaller member states like Belgium or Austria. And I have here also the last figures. Between 2000 and 2010, national budget in the EU increased by 62%. That's more or less the double of the European budget. So I think if we want to make a real federal European Union, as we need in the world of tomorrow, the least we can say is that 1% shall be not enough in the future. It's a good starting point now, but it cannot be the end game for the future if we want to really tackle the problems, if we want to overcome the euro crisis, if we want to have a general federal union, we shall need more. And finally, Mr. President, cuts in the European budget are seen in many of our member states, and certainly in Britain, as the way to solve their budgetary problems. But I think that the opposite is true. A strong European budget is the only way to overcome the budgetary problems of the member states, pooling money on the European level instead of wasting money on the national level. And so I think that we have to be very firm on this, and that politically this Parliament has to be ready to block a deal if the deal is not what has been proposed by the European Commission.